Sean Strickland became UFC champion in the one way the system is supposed to respect the most. He didn't win on hype. He didn't win on controversy. He didn't win because the UFC needed him to win. He walked into enemy territory against a champion the promotion had already invested years into and took the belt cleanly. 5 rounds. No robbery, no debate. By the logic the UFC publicly claims to operate on, that should have been the moment everything shifted. The company should have pivoted. The spotlight should have followed the belt. The marketing machine should have adjusted. But none of that happened. Instead, the UFC treated Sean Strickland's championship like an anomaly, something to survive, not something to build around. This is where most people get it wrong. The common explanation is simple and comforting. Sean Strickland talks too much. He says the wrong things. He makes the UFC uncomfortable. That story turns this into a personality problem. It implies that if Strickland were quieter, more polished, more professional, the UFC would have embraced him. But that explanation falls apart the moment you look at the UFC's own history. This is a company that has never been afraid of controversy. Fighters who embarrassed themselves, offended sponsors, crossed lines, and created chaos were not pushed away, they were monetized. Controversy has never been the issue. Control has. Sean Strickland isn't dangerous to the UFC because of what he says. He's dangerous because of what he can't be made to say. He doesn't follow the script. He doesn't correct himself when the brand would prefer silence. And more importantly, he doesn't adjust his behavior to protect the system that profits from him. That makes him unpredictable in the only way that actually matters. Not in the cage, but outside of it. The UFC doesn't build around champions. It builds around certainty. Around fighters who can be scheduled, shaped, redirected, and marketed without creating risk. A belt does not guarantee protection. A win does not guarantee investment. And a champion who refuses to behave like an asset becomes a liability the moment the belt is wrapped around their waist. Sean Strickland proved something far more unsettling than the fact that he could win a title. He proved that winning is not the final test. Compatibility is. And once you understand that, the real question stops being, why doesn't the UFC like Sean Strickland? The question becomes much darker. What kind of champion does the UFC actually want to build around, and what happens to the ones who don't fit? After Sean Strickland won the title, the most revealing detail wasn't what the UFC did next. It was what they didn't do. There was no clear shift in messaging, no visible long-term positioning, no sense that the promotion was reorganizing the division around its new champion. The belt changed hands, but the machine didn't change direction. That silence wasn't accidental. It was structural. In the UFC, winning is not the finish line. It's a checkpoint. Fighters are constantly told that performance is everything, that results speak for themselves. But in practice, results only matter when they align with the company's broader needs. The UFC doesn't operate like a traditional sport league that builds around whoever reaches the top. It operates like an entertainment business that prioritizes reliability, predictability, and brand control. Champions aren't crowned to be empowered. They're crowned to be useful. Sean Strickland disrupted that equation, not because he won the belt, but because he won it without becoming more manageable afterward. In most cases, the UFC's ideal champion becomes quieter after reaching the top. Media appearances become safer. Language becomes polished. The fighter learns, sometimes unconsciously, how to protect the brand that now protects them. Strickland didn't make that shift. His behavior didn't soften. His tone didn't adjust. And crucially, he didn't signal that he understood the unspoken expectations that come with being built around. This is where the misunderstanding begins for many fans. They assume the UFC's distance from Strickland is about punishment. It's not. The UFC rarely punishes fighters directly. Instead, it withholds investment. No narrative expansion. No strategic matchmaking designed to maximize longevity. No protective framing when controversy arises. In a system where promotion, scheduling, and visibility are everything, being ignored is far more damaging than being criticized. The UFC doesn't need to publicly oppose a fighter it can't fully control. It simply waits. The organization has patience because it controls time, opportunity, and access. A champion who doesn't fit the model doesn't need to be removed immediately. The system just has to keep moving until a replacement appears, someone equally competitive but easier to shape. That's why Strickland's championship felt temporary the moment it happened. Not because he wasn't good enough, but because he wasn't compatible. The belt, in this structure, is not a symbol of authority. It's a responsibility to continue serving the system's interests. When a champion shows signs that they won't play that role, the system prepares for the next phase quietly. The UFC's relationship with champions has always been transactional, but with Strickland, the transaction broke down almost immediately. Not because he failed to deliver value, but because he delivered the wrong kind of value. He proved he could win without fitting into the promotional architecture the UFC depends on. That's a problem no belt can fix. The UFC does not build around champions who introduce uncertainty. It builds around champions who reduce it. Fighters who can be placed into predictable media cycles, whose behavior can be anticipated weeks in advance, whose presence reassures sponsors rather than forces risk assessments. When a champion forces the company to constantly react instead of plan, the system pulls back. Not loudly, not publicly, quietly. This is where the idea of marketability is often misunderstood. Marketability is not about popularity alone. It's about control over narrative. A fighter doesn't need to be universally liked. They need to be steerable. They need to understand where the lines are and, more importantly, respect them without being told. Strickland never showed that instinct. He didn't misstep once. He consistently refused to self-regulate in a way the UFC could depend on. That made him a liability long before it made him a champion. The UFC's promotional strategy relies on long arcs, rivalries that can be extended, champions that can be positioned as ambassadors, figures who can carry a division through press tours, broadcast deals, and sponsor activations without forcing constant damage control. Strickland didn't just fail to play that role. He made it clear he had no interest in learning it. And in a system built on repetition and predictability, that's disqualifying. So the UFC did what it always does in these situations. It refused to escalate its commitment. No aggressive narrative investment. No framing him as the future of the division. No insulation from the consequences of his own unpredictability. This wasn't neglect. It was strategy. The UFC understands something most fans don't. Attention is currency, and withholding it is a form of control. A champion who isn't built around becomes easier to replace. Without a carefully constructed image, there's no long-term story to protect. Without that story, the belt becomes interchangeable. That's why Strickland's reign never felt like a foundation. It felt like a pause, a temporary disruption while the system waited for someone more compatible to emerge. And this is the point where the reality becomes uncomfortable. The UFC doesn't reward authenticity. It tolerates it when convenient. It doesn't punish fighters for being themselves. It simply refuses to invest in them. In a business where visibility defines value, that distinction matters more than any fine or suspension ever could. Strickland exposed a limit the UFC rarely admits exists. You can win the belt. You can beat the man they built everything around, and still be treated as expendable, because in this system, being the best fighter is secondary to being the right type of fighter. And the moment those two things stop overlapping, the machine starts looking past you. What Strickland ultimately revealed is not a flaw in himself, but a rule the UFC never says out loud. The organization does not build around the most dangerous fighter. It builds around the most dependable one. Dependable doesn't mean obedient in a dramatic sense. It means predictable under pressure. Predictable when the belt is on the line. Predictable when sponsors are watching. Predictable when the company needs silence instead of honesty. This is why the UFC's real stars are rarely accidents. They are selected. Not after they win, but long before. Their rise is aligned with the company's needs. Their personalities are compatible with long-term promotion. Their public behavior lowers risk instead of raising questions. When these fighters win, the system accelerates around them. Matchmaking protects momentum. Media amplifies narratives. Controversy, when it appears, is controlled and redirected. That is what being built around actually looks like. Strickland was never in that category. not because he wasn't good enough, but because he wasn't moldable enough. His unpredictability didn't create buzz the UFC could harness. It created friction the company had to constantly absorb. And friction is expensive. It forces reaction instead of planning. It turns marketing into damage control. It makes every appearance a variable instead of an asset. This is the moment where the belief most fans hold finally breaks. The UFC does not crown champions and then decide whether to support them. It decides who to support first, and the belt follows when possible. When the wrong person wins at the wrong time, the system doesn't collapse. It waits. It minimizes exposure. It shortens the window, and it prepares the transition to someone who fits the long-term structure better. Strickland's reign exposed how temporary power really is inside the UFC. The belt gives visibility, not leverage. It gives responsibility, not authority. The champion does not steer the system. The system steers the champion or replaces them. That's why Strickland's win felt disruptive, but never transformative. He interrupted the plan. He didn't become it. And this is the core truth that makes his case so uncomfortable. You can do everything right inside the cage and still fail the test that matters most outside of it. The UFC doesn't ask whether you deserve to be built around. It asks whether you are safe to build around. Those are not the same question. And Sean Strickland answered the second one in a way the system couldn't accept. What makes Strickland's situation linger isn't what happened to him. It's what it signals to everyone watching. His title reign wasn't treated as a foundation. It was treated as a gap, a period the system needed to pass through, not expand upon. And that changes how every future champion should interpret success inside the UFC. Because once you see this pattern, you can't unsee it. Winning doesn't shift power. It reveals whether power was ever intended to be shared. The UFC's structure is built to absorb outcomes it doesn't prefer without ever acknowledging resistance. When the wrong champion emerges, the system doesn't panic. It narrows the margins. It limits exposure. It accelerates the search for someone more compatible. And when that person arrives, the transition happens quickly, cleanly, and without explanation. This is why the most important negotiations in the UFC don't happen after a belt is won. They happen before a fighter ever becomes champion. Visibility, protection, and longevity are decided upstream. By the time the belt changes hands, the real decision has often already been made. Who is expandable? Who is scalable? Who can carry the structure forward without forcing it to adapt? Strickland's case makes one thing clear. The UFC doesn't fear outspoken fighters. It fears fighters it can't stabilize. Fighters who don't self-correct. Fighters who don't internalize the limits of their role once the stakes rise. Not because those fighters threaten the sport, but because they expose the business. They remind everyone that the belt is not the top of the hierarchy. It's a position within it. And that leaves a question hanging over every division, every contender, every future champion watching from the sidelines. If winning is no longer the deciding factor, then what is? If the belt doesn't guarantee investment, then what kind of fighter does the UFC actually want standing at the center of its empire? The system hasn't changed. It doesn't need to. It simply waits for the next champion who fits not just in the cage, but in every place the cage touches. And when that happens, the machine won't hesitate. It will move forward as if the disruption never mattered at all.